Hey, you guys, before we get started and really get into this week's podcast, I just wanted to let you know that the man that I'm interviewing this week, he went through extreme childhood torture and abuse. And his abuser was his father, who was involved in a Satanist group. And his story is really extreme. So before we get into it, I just wanted to let you know that. And his story is so powerful of how he overcome. But yet he said this to me when I was interviewing him just on the phone. He said, some people will turn to faith because of what happened to them. And then others will turn away from faith because of what happened to them. And this is true on so many levels. But what Jimmi Toro went through was a lot of abuse and torture, and his abusers would use scripture and read it over him. So I want to ask you this question. How would you feel if you're a believer now, but how would you feel if you were a child and someone abused you and they read scripture over you while they did it? And in your mind, you're thinking, wow, God must be bad, or God must be mad at me, or God must not really care about me. He cares about everybody else, but he doesn't care about me. And at that point, I believe that the worst kind of abuse is religious abuse, because it plants a seed into the heart of a child that tells them that God does not love them. You got to hear Jimmy's story. And meanwhile, I want us to really think about this question and how you and I can reach out to people who have been spiritually abused, but also been spiritually tortured, and how we can help them. And one of the things that I think we can do, and how people will know that we're disciples, is by the love of God and just loving people where they are. All right? Listen to today's podcast. Let me know what you think about it.
Hi, this is One Voice Makes a Difference podcast. I pray that today one voice will be a blessing to you. And above all else, I pray that God's voice will be heard among this God's story. Enjoy today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to One Voice Makes a Difference. I'm so glad that you have joined us today. You guys, today is going to be a little bit different. I have a very, very special guest on with us today, and he has a story that I think that will impact your life. And his story is a story of one that when I read about it and I heard about him, I had this pain in my heart. It was a familiar pain because some of you that have been through childhood sexual abuse or trauma, you know exactly what that feels like. But Jimmi Toro is with us today, and he went through childhood abuse, sexual abuse, and trauma, but just even a step further, he went through so much torture as a child, and people did this in the name of God. And I think this is the worst kind of abuse that could happen, because it creates a belief system, or it creates things in your heart that, like Jimmy, we were talking earlier, either some people turn to God or they'll turn away and ask God, why did you allow these things to happen to us? And I know you guys have probably had those questions too. But today I want to introduce Jimmi Toro to you. He is an American contemporary artist. He's an author, composer, multi-instrumentalist, music producer, and a founder of the Rescue 11, a nonprofit whose mission is to protect our children from awful child abusers. He is a survivor, and I want to say that again, a survivor of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, and torture. Jimmy, thank you so much for being on our podcast today. One Voice Makes a Difference, and your voice is making a difference everywhere you go because of what you are doing, telling your story and sharing it with people. Welcome to One Voice.
Thank you for the opportunity to get the message out. Most people in most communities do not understand that these predators live right in their communities. They're often mayors, politicians, coaches, somebody you meet in a grocery store, and they are actively plotting to hurt your children.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that it could be the nice person next door to you and you don't even know that they're there. Right.
Yeah. So thank you for being a platform to let both of us get this out even further.
Yes, I'm so happy to have you on and happy for you to share your story with us. I was reading a little bit in your bio, and your manager sent me this paragraph, and it really stood out to me and really pricked my heart. He said, "Imagine, if you will, a group of sadist cowards burying a 4-year-old child alive in a coffin that contained a dead adult body with its guts ripped out. All of this planned out so they could enjoy the horrific, frightening screams of that child, only pulling him out after his fight to escape exhausted him to near death." And I asked you this question: did that happen to you? Because I'm thinking that's torture. So you said, yeah, this did happen to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. The one other thing that many people do not understand is these sadists. So the definition of a sadist is somebody who enjoys inflicting pain on another. They get joy out of it, right? Which on its own is really twisted and really evil, right? And so what these sadists do is they come up with all kinds of imaginative ways to inflict pain on others. And the worst of these people are those who inflict pain on the best people in the world, which are the children.
Yeah.
And they're cowards. I call them cowards because they are. And, children don't fight back.
Yeah.
And so it's easy prey for them.
Right.
Now, if you want to add the God angle to this, many of these folks are Satan worshipers, let's say, and their enemy is God. And so they look at that and they say, well, what can we do to upset God the most? Well, we can abuse his little children, the most purest humans. And when children are little, they literally are pure. And as we grow, we get corrupted in some degree and sinful and whatnot as we age. And so that's another way of trying to understand why they do this. And so they find joy in finding the most pure, the most innocent, and inflicting the most pain upon them. And yes, this happened to me, and I was 3 or 4 years old, somewhere in that range. And this is one of the hundreds of tortures that happened to me. And yes, it's absolutely awful. And another thing people don't understand is many of these predators, if you have a conversation about how evil a person is, it's an interesting conversation. You could say, well, maybe Hitler or Stalin, or some of these dictators were the most evil people who walked on the earth. And yes, they were awful. But I would suggest that these predators are at a different level of evil. It's very personal. They will kill children. They will. I don't know how graphic you want to get here, but I could go really graphic, and I don't want to if you don't want me to. But
yeah, I want to hear the real story, because I'm listening to you and reading this. Number one, where did this dead body come from that they threw you into this coffin, and how are they out there not getting caught for what they're doing?
That's a good question. So some of these predators organize in groups, and they do it for, let's say, 2 main reasons. You have a group of predators who will kidnap and steal children to satisfy their customers, who are the pedophiles and the real worst of the worst.
Okay.
Like a prostitute. A classic example of a male will go and pay money for a prostitute, right?
Right.
Well, in their world, an adult will go and pay money for a little child.
Wow.
And they get to do the worst things to that child for money. often one of the things that the worst of the worst do is they end up killing the child as part of their sick pleasure.
Mm.
And another thing that sort of makes sense into this is, have you heard of the term adrenochrome?
No.
When a child, or anybody, when a child gets scared, adrenaline rushes into your body, because that's what happens. The panic, fight or flight bit.
Right.
And it laces their blood with adrenaline, and they call it adrenochrome.
Okay.
And these creeps want that blood. They drink it because it gives them a certain high.
What?
And yeah, they do. It's absolutely awful. And there's another group of these creeps who believe that youthful blood will give them longevity. It'll make them more youthful, almost like you get a transfusion of young blood.
Mm.
And so if you take an adult who abuses a kid at this level, that's bad enough. But what makes it worse is often the adult who's abusing such kids is sexually aroused when they do it, which is off the charts unimaginable.
Right.
And as part of their what they do, they literally will, if there's not blood involved, they're not interested.
Mm.
And it's just at that really awful level. And most people don't realize that millions of children have and are being abused at this level, and they are really, really good at hiding it. So you have the perpetrators who feed these. They're really clever, by the way. They are way smart. They like, for instance, there's a place in Poland, a compound, let's say, that does this, and they will kidnap a child, and let's say the child is named Susie. Well, if Susie's missing, the local police will look for Susie, and they don't want that. So they'll take Susie and they'll get Susie into an Arab country where it's legal for an adult male to marry a little child.
Wow.
They'll marry that little child, bring that child back under a different name. So now the child is, Janet or whatever.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
It just came out because we're talking. It's a different name, and now nobody's looking for this child with a different name. Now they're really clever. They will entice young girls who are pregnant to have abortions at their facilities. So it's actually not an abortion. They actually take the child and they raise it in their facility, and it gets abused and abused and abused. Some young girls will, mostly girls, unfortunately, some young girls will be raped thousands and thousands of times over years. And then when their body is just useless or worn out, they will kill the child and they will harvest its organs on the black market and make more money. So there's a really, really, really sick underground of this kind of stuff happening. In my case, I was part of, and this is where religion comes into it. I was part of a ritualistic sexual abuse ring of adults. And the reason I say religion gets brought into this is because they often steal from religious ceremonies and traditions.
Mm.
One of the more classic, well-known traditions of religions would be the Jewish history, because it's all through the Bible.
Right.
When Moses came onto play, and the Ark of the Covenant and the robes and all that kind of stuff. You can go to Jerusalem today. I've seen it. They have a small scale model of the temple that they are predicted to build, Solomon's temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they know all the robes, all the symbolism with the priests wear, and they have it all ready to go.
Wow.
It's all done. They're just waiting for the day when they can go build their temple, right? And so these traditions of robes and ceremonies and chantings and whatnot, these satanic groups, well, they do the same thing. They're not very original. They just kind of rip off what good people do, in my opinion.
Right.
And so I was involved in this type of group of these a group of adults, and there were quite a few children involved. And number one, they're very good at hiding this.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very good. They have their secret oaths and covenants. Many religions and other groups have oaths and you make promises that if you're gonna follow God, you may make a promise to God that I will be moral, I will be chaste, I will be honest. You make these promises. Well, they make their same promises to Satan in the evil side of things.
Wow.
And they, not too dissimilar to, let's say, if you're a member of the mob, if you leave the mob and go against your covenants you made in the mob, they'll come kill you.
Right.
So there's that, and so they're
the same scenario.
Good. Yeah, very similar scenario. But they dress in their robes and they do their thing. They sacrifice children, and occasionally they sacrifice adults. And well, why do they do it? Well, they're sadists. Sadist, Satan. Same terminology, right?
Right.
Well, that's what they enjoy.
Wow.
Which is absolutely impossible for a good person to wrap their mind around it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess that's the first time I've ever heard of the word sadist. And I was reading through it and I was like, oh, it looks like the word sad. Like they are sad cowards for sure. But a sadist, it kind of now reminds me of a word of Satanist, of someone, because Satan does love torture. He loves to, he loves to inflict torture upon God's children, which we are all God's children. All of us are. And we were all created by God, and so Satan comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And he does it in the most creative ways. My thing is, how in the world, though, can you get by with it in the United States and it's next door? And they're killing children and they're torturing them. And how are they keeping it a secret? What do you think that we can do as neighbors to be aware of these things? Do they hide it just that good? Or is there something that we could be aware of that, hey, this person, I think it's important to have discernment. People that have discernment know something's off. I can tell you, I can meet people somewhere and I know when something's off. I know when something has happened to someone. But for the average Joe, they don't even know that, that these things are happening to people, let alone that they could be next door. Right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I currently live in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Mm-hmm.
In the last year, an ex-attorney general was busted for child abuse. An ex-mayor of a city called West Bountiful, it's just right outside of Salt Lake, was busted for child abuse.
Wow.
A coach at a high school was busted for. Just last week, I saw on the news a gentleman was running a gymnasium for budding gymnasts, which is a bunch of young kids, to be honest.
Yeah.
He was busted. He had these cameras in the girls and boys' bathrooms. And so voyeurism, which is a form of child abuse, and
right.
And so often police officers are busted for it, politicians, etc. There's a guy here who was busted on 12 counts of rape, and he's a sex therapist.
What? Oh my gosh.
Another thing that's interesting is that if you think of youth groups, because these creeps, they love the kids.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of youth groups from orphanages to like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and any other youth type of group, they often join these groups, and people don't know. They just think they're good people wanting to help kids.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a classic scenario is more publicly known are, let's say, Catholic priests who've been busted for abusing young boys.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because they're around those young boys all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So these pedophiles, these creeps, they are very, very clever at getting what they want and hiding what they want. They're the ultimate hypocrites. They often hide in religion under banners like lawyers, things that we respect. Oh, he's a lawyer, or he's a doctor, or she, this or that.
Right.
Yeah. So they hide right in plain sight, and they are not dumb people.
Yeah.
They're really good. They're amazing liars, but fortunately, occasionally they get busted.
Yeah.
And
They
so
get caught. Yeah.
yeah, and so well, how do we make people aware of that? So one of the agendas with our nonprofit is to go into communities, primarily via high schools, and to teach first of all, to teach kids and adults how these predators get to your kids online.
That's good.
Well, yeah, most people cannot answer that. And they're clever. They pose as kids their age. They offer them jobs. They offer them money. They offer them opportunities. If you imagine like a lion out in the wilderness and a bunch of wildebeests run by, and that lion is just looking for the young one, the old one, the weak one that they can pick off easy. So they're not going to go after the most healthiest bull, because that's going to be a fight, and they might. And so these predators are like that. They know how to recognize children. They will go sit in malls and just sit there and watch kids. And if they see like 3 little 13-year-old girls walking along, they're good at thinking, okay, that one is just oblivious to everything going around her. She's got her face buried in her phone. She looks kind of maybe depressed or whatever. And they know how to target these people.
Wow.
And they use youth to target them. They use other kids their age to target them that they pay money to. They're very clever. And so our goal is to go into communities via high schools and set up a club at a high school and help kids in this club be aware of this, and have these kids reach out into the community to other nonprofits, to law enforcement, to politicians, to lawyers, because there's a whole legal side of this.
Yeah.
And make a community aware that this is happening in their community. I mean, the most simple thing you can do is go on the sex offender registry list and see how many sex offenders are in your neighborhood.
Right.
In my sleepy little neighborhood, because I live in a little suburb outside of the city, just in a mile radius, there's 10 to 15 registered sex offenders.
Wow.
And unfortunately, most of these sex offenders do not and will not repent and change. That's who they are, and that's who they stay till the day they die, for the most part. And well, if there are that many registered sex offenders just in a mile radius of my little area, well, go into your state, look it up. Like in the state of Utah, there's like 700 and some sex offenders in the state of Utah. Well, those are the registered ones. What about the ones who haven't been voted yet?
That's right.
There's thousands of them that haven't been found out, because they're pretty good at hiding it.
And you know what? I believe right now in our day and time, it's easier to pinpoint them and find them, because now we have, they're registered. We can see who's next door. But 20, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have that. And like for me, my stepfather was my abuser. I was the victim. And, I would try to tell someone, but I feared for my life, because he told me he would kill me if I told anyone. And then I just got the courage up one day and I said, you know what? I'm going to call the police. So I ended up calling the police. They came and they picked me up, took me into foster care. But I want you to know that man did not spend one day in jail for what he did. Not one day.
Okay, so Janet, why do you think, I'm just talking with you, why do you think that man who the police were aware of him, am I correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Why do you think he got off?
Because he said he didn't do it, and they believed him.
There you go. They are so clever. Often they'll take they will, if they're involved in a family, like in my case, there were a lot of kids in my family, they will often pick on one or two, but not the rest, because they know if the one kid says, hey, something's happening to me, and then they talk to the other kids, and the others, no, nothing happened to me. Well, they won't believe the one kid.
That's right.
Now, I don't know how many siblings you had when all this was happening in your life, but and then you mentioned the death threats. When a kid is threatened to death like that, it is very serious to that kid, and that kid believes it 100%. And it takes a whole hell of a lot of courage for that kid to open their mouth up.
That's right.
And it's rare. So another reason why they get away with it, because the odds are in their favor. They can, let's say 100 kids are abused when they're little like that. only a few percentage will have the courage to come forward and say it at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
As they get older, they often say it, but by then the abuser's gone and off the radar and this and
Mm-hmm.
that. And unfortunately, in some cases, the politicians, once again, and often police officers get busted. They're often in on it. And so in your case, you probably don't know, but it's as likely as not that the police officer who knew about your situation, he could have been a pedophile. He could have been in on it.
Yeah.
He could have been paid off.
Wow. That is crazy when you look back on it, because I would think, like, they took me away from the home. You know, they knew, like, there was my social worker. She believed me and she really poured into my life. And then I was separated from them and went to live with my dad after that and never lived with them again. But my thing is, back then, you didn't go to jail for that, even though it was illegal. You know, if he said he didn't do it, you're not going to go to jail for it. But after he died and he suffered a horrible death, there was like 15 of my cousins that came around the table of my mother's house and said that he had done the same thing to them. And I'll never forget when my mom called me, she said, "Hey, I just want to ask you to forgive me because I didn't believe you. And now I believe you, and all of these girls have been abused." So it was many people even before I arrived on the scenes. It was just easier now because now I'm in the home. My cousins were outside the home and he abused them before my mom married him. So it was, you know, it was a big deal for me because truth had been revealed. Like, oh, people believe me now. And let me tell you, Jimmy, that was 20 years later. I carried it around for 20 years. My mom didn't believe me. My brothers didn't believe me. Nobody believed me. The only person that believed me was my father, my biological father. And I ended up living with him. And when I got married, I told my husband about it, or we were dating, and I told him, and he believed me. And I just stuffed it. I didn't tell anybody else about it. Not until I got into my late 40s when everybody died. My stepfather died, my mom died, my dad died, and all these things began to surface. And that's what happens a lot of times is the older we get, the things that we have stuffed deep down in our soul, they begin to surface, or something will trigger it, like a death or an image or something like this will happen. And we begin to remember those all over again. And I know for you, you said it doesn't happen just one time to you. You relive it over and over and over. So, I asked you, how did you, you said you lived these hundreds of similar horrors twice, not just what happened to you, but in your adulthood. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How did it bring up things in you and that you relived them over again?
Right. So what's fascinating about all this is that if let's say if you're a young kid and you get abused, right?
Mm-hmm.
If right on the heels of that abuse, you have somebody to go to who really cares for you, who loves you, who provides safety. The one thing you want as a kid more than anything is you want to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be protected. If you have that immediately, like a stranger comes and abuses you and you have a loving mother and father you can go to and find that safety, you can release all of that abuse right then and there.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, or like in your case, in my case, or your stepfather, your caretaker is your abuser,
mm-hmm.
and your mom doesn't believe, you don't have anybody to go to for safety.
Right.
So you literally store all that in your body. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that has come out in the last 10 years, recent, that proves all this to be true. Not only do you store the memory of it in your body, and it's somewhere deep in your brain, they know where it is, you store all of the emotion of it, the fear, the scared feelings, every emotion is stored in there.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, also when you were abused, at the time, you had these hormones push out into your body, this fight or flight. There's fight, there's flight, there's freeze. There's one called fawn, which is a little bit rare.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're walking down a path and a lion jumps in front of you, your body gets pumped with adrenaline, and because it gives you strength. Well, what happens to your body when it does that? It shoots the blood away from your organs into your hands and feet so you can run or fight. And well, you can recover from that fairly quickly after the event, and it won't affect you too much. But if that happens to you over and over and over, abuse, years and years and years, that hormonal dump, primarily cortisol and adrenaline, they're harmful to the body. It will have a harmful effect on your body.
Wow.
It stresses your organs, et cetera, et cetera. That happens when you're a kid. All of that is stored. And so as an adult, when the memory comes back, sometimes the memory will just resurface randomly. In my case, completely random. Sometimes something will trigger that memory and it'll come back. If it comes back strong, it comes back with a vengeance. Not just the memory, the adrenaline repeats itself. It literally pushes through your whole body again. You experience all the panic, all the fear, all the scared, no different than what that little you experienced.
Wow.
And when it hits you, my case, my heart would just race off the clock. My breathing would just go crazy. My mouth would go dry. My whole body would just shake, uncontrollably shake. And the pain was off the charts painful. And I literally felt like I was going to die. Literally, felt like the life was being squeezed out of me. I had no energy. I couldn't move from here to there. And so that is a reoccurrence of that trauma hitting you as an adult. So you do live it twice.
Yeah.
It comes back the second time. And if you don't know how to deal with it, well, you just get through it if you can live through it. But hopefully we can have this discussion later about different ways to heal from it, different ways to deal with it. You see it in classic situations of CPT or PTSD, which is primarily associated with military folks. They're out in the field and they're looking at their buddy and just talking, and then his head blows up because a bullet went through it.
Right.
Well, that has a massive traumatic effect on that young boy.
Right.
And he comes back to the States. He gets released, and he could hear an explosion or lightning, and it'll trigger all that emotion and all that hormone, all that trauma will rush through his body again.
Wow.
So that's PTSD, which post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people don't know there's a C PTSD, C standing for child. So when these memories came back to you and me, we experienced C PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder in some form. And people don't realize that all that is stored and all of it releases again. And the adult side of it happening in some ways can be worse than when it happened as a kid, because you don't know the duration of it. It can hit you at any time. For me, I went through 15 years of this before I was able to figure out how to solve it. So for 15 years, these episodes hit me 2 or 3 times a week. I've experienced thousands of them.
Did you have triggers? Is that how they would?
No.
Or just come out of nowhere?
Mine came completely unannounced. I could be in a business meeting and it would hit me.
Really?
Yeah. So that's not terribly uncommon.
Yeah.
Both are equally common, let's say. It can be a trigger. So that's the awful side of reliving it the second time.
Yeah.
And that's where, as an adult, you think about God and life a little bit different than you do when you're a kid. Because when you're a kid going through that, often that's your normal.
Yeah.
Because that happens to you at those really young ages.
Yeah.
As an adult, you figure out life a little bit, and then you have to relive all that. And you're like, okay, where's God?
Yeah.
And why does God allow, the ultimate question, why the ultimate question about God that many smart people have tried to answer, and that is, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people, especially little children?
Yeah.
That I've never heard an answer to that is satisfying. I've heard a lot of people try to answer it, and when I listen to their answer, I say, well, you also don't really know. And so, we can guess, we can say, God allows it because he obviously allows evil to walk on the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, if he didn't, he would wipe it all away and we'd all live in some sort of paradise,
Mm-hmm.
which many Christians believe it will happen in the next life and whatnot.
Right.
But that's a tough one, Janet. That's a really tough one to answer. And you and your role as somebody who preaches, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever spoken about that subject specifically, but that's a tough one.
It is. And I was going to ask you really how this affected your faith, because faith is more than just religion. And a lot of people have religion, and it could be a lot of people abuse in the name of religion. And we know that there's good and bad out there. So if there's evil, and we know that there's an author of evil, then there's an author of good, right? So I don't have all the answers, and I think there's some things that we won't know until we get to heaven. And I believe that we'll see things very clearly when we get to heaven. We'll understand it better.
Yeah, there'd be no faith if we knew everything, right?
Exactly. And, there's just some things that I can't answer. I've heard people answer that question like, well, God gives everybody free choice, free will. My answer is like for you, for what happened to you and what happened to me, it was just demons, and they inflicted torture, and that's what they love to do. And it's sad that we were the victims of that, but somehow you overcame it, and you grew up and you looked at life differently. And, I believe that God looks upon you and he's proud of you, of how far you've come, and that you overcome torture, you overcome abuse, and you're still doing it. And now you're helping other people, because that's what God wants us to do. Our voices together, Jimmy, we can make a difference together.
Yeah.
And the way that we know people who really serve Jesus is by the love that we have for one another. There's people in the name of religion. After I wrote my book, I had many people call me up and say, hey, my dad was a doctor. He sexually abused me. He was a deacon in the church, and he wore a title, and and now I'm hurting and I'm suffering. And they would come to our church. We would pray with them. But more than anything, we just accepted them and loved them. And that's how it's a community of people who love one another, accept one another. And we believe in a great big God that can rescue us from our troubles, right? Yeah. So for you, and a lot of times when abuse does happen to us as children, we don't know how to tell someone about it, or we don't know, because it's our normal. We're like, this is the normal thing. For me, the abuse started at 10 years old. It was from 10 to 12. So I had a sense already of what is good and what is bad.
You did.
Right?
Yes.
And I was like, well, when it began to happen to me, my biological father never told me he loved me and then would do those things to me. He told me he loved me all the time, right? My biological father, my real father. But my stepfather would sexually abuse me and do it in the name of love. Like, this is love. This is why I do these things. So for me, growing up, love was distorted. I was like, well, this is what love is. But I said all that to say this, is that I had a sense of like, this is not good. This is not normal. I don't like the way this feels. I feel yucky. I feel dirty. And I need to tell someone. And I don't even know, Jimmy, how I had the strength and the courage at 12 years old to stand up to a frightening man that I had seen hurt so many people, and to stare him in the face as a child and say, you're not going to do this to me any longer. And I got away from it. A lot of people don't have that. And That's another question. Why does everybody feel like they have to stay in it, and why do they have to suffer? And I know we're using our voices now to equip people. Like, we want to go into the schools and say, hey, you can use your voice to make a difference, and you can tell somebody. If you're going through something, you can tell somebody. I want to ask you, Jimmi, for you said the abuse started from age 3, maybe to 8. How did it stop? How did someone rescue you, or did the abuse just stop? And what happened after it stopped?
All right, so it's common in those situations for a kid to suppress those memories.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the abuse started trickling off around age 8, let's say, I have all the memories came to me just last year, fairly recent. So for all those years, even age 9, 10, 11, I had no memory of this.
And how old are you now?
60.
60. So when you were 59, everything started to surface.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So for all those years, the body kept it in.
Yeah.
Well, in researching it, it's not uncommon that these perpetrators. This is going to sound really sick, but it's like going to a restaurant and looking at a menu and ordering what you want. Many of these perpetrators like 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds, but not 8-year-olds. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They have their preferences. Also, too, especially with boys, when boys turn about age 8, the human brain doesn't develop till around age 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, the brain is in this state where it just literally soaks in everything that is in your environment. It soaks it in. Mm-hmm. You're like a sponge. Now, out around age 7 or 8, that changes. Well, little boys, often, sometimes girls, will get a little bit wise to what's going on maybe around age 8. Maybe physically they're grown up and they can fight back a little bit. Maybe they start seeing the world a little bit differently. And so often these perpetrators know that that's about the age when they need to stop.
Right.
Because they'll be found out or it'll be more of a fight. So that's common. It's more common that young girls get abused longer. Because more men want to abuse girls than more men want to abuse boys.
Right.
They're a class of, and most, it's not just men, but it's mostly men,
right,
who do the abuse, right? And most of them prefer young girls. There's a subsection of them who prefer either both or young boys. And so girls get picked on a whole lot more than boys. Just in classic cases of young girls being raped. Abuse from domestic violence to rape and whatnot. By far, the young girls have it a lot worse than the young boys.
Yeah.
And that's kind of sad. So in my case, I literally suppressed that for 50 some years. And so I don't know exactly why it stopped. I just know that when all the memories came back, all the memories came flooding back in a period of about 9 months. And that was the worst part of all of this, is that was my absolutely hell, those 9 months. And they kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. And when those memories ended, I knew at that point, okay, the last memories I had were when I was about 8.
Mm-hmm. So was your abuser your father, your stepfather, someone in the home?
So my father was involved with a group of other parents in a town in Central California, and they were ritualistic. They often performed their evil in churches, believe it or not.
Wow.
Basements of churches. One of them was a pastor or bishop or whatever you'd say of a congregation, one of the abusers. And my father was wrapped up into that group. He wasn't the leader. My father was pretty much a coward. Well, they're all cowards because they prey on kids, but he wasn't a leader type, but he was wrapped up into it. And yes, he was part of it. I had no like we discussed earlier, I had nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So all got sucked in.
And so how was that relationship after the age of 8 or 10 years old with him, and as you grew older?
That's interesting, because if you would have asked me that question a year ago, before the memory started flooding back, I would have just said, oh, it was okay. I had no connection with him as an abuser. But now that I look back, knowing what I know, like for instance, when he passed away, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, when he died, me and a couple siblings were at the funeral home, and we're making the arrangements, and we walk into this room, there's my dead father, right? And I remember looking at him and feeling nothing. And it shocked me. It's like, I should be mourning because my father passed away. I felt absolutely nothing, and I couldn't figure out why. Now I know why.
Wow,
so,
incredible.
But my dad was never close to us. I did, classic situation where a father is distant, let's say. I don't ever remember him coming to any school events, sporting events, anything. He was just there. He was kind of absent-minded guy. We grew up in extreme poverty. He was always out of a job or this or that, and no closeness.
What about your mother?
Yeah, that's a more interesting discussion, because I don't believe she was there at those events where they would gather as groups, and they would put on their robes and do chants and. Okay, so if you imagine like a KKK rally where they're all dressed in white and they're all around this center cross, and the cross is burning, we've seen pictures of that. They do stuff like that.
Wow.
And my mother, I don't remember her at any of those. I believe she was threatened, like many females are. Yeah. Situations. And we had 10 kids, and it was a busy. And out of the 10 kids, 2 of us were caught up. Me and my sister were caught up in this.
Wow.
The others were not. And so, and back then, same thing. I wasn't close to my mom. I never once remembered going to her for safety. I mean, you have kids. When kids are little, they just skin their knee. What do they immediately do? Just naturally.
Go to their mom.
They go to their mom, and they want a hug and a kiss. They want that safety.
Yeah.
You don't have that? It's kind of messy.
Yeah. That's crazy. Yeah. Well, Jimmy, first of all, I just want to say to you, I am so sorry, and even to your sister, that those things happened to you. And I grieve over that, and I grieve over what happens to a lot of children.
Yes.
And I think now you can use your story to help people. And you guys that are listening out there, I just want to share something with you, that statistics say that 1 out of every 4 girls is sexually abused before the age of 12. And it's 1 out of 6 or 7. I've heard different statistics of boys. Yeah. That they're abused before the age of 12. And it's usually by someone that they know. And the reason why, I even started this podcast and the campaign is to make a difference, one person at a time. And that's how we make a difference, is just by talking to one person at a time. If you're listening to this, or maybe you're watching on YouTube, and these things are happening to you, or it has happened to you, we want you to know there is a way out, and you can tell somebody. That's what our campaign is about. #tell somebody. Tell somebody if you're going. That's how I got out, was by telling someone. And I had no one to go to. I was like, Jimmy, I didn't have anybody there. I tried to talk with my mom, but it didn't work. And I ended up calling the police. So if there's someone that you can talk to, your mom or a teacher or someone at your church, and the thing is that bad things do happen to good people all the time, and it doesn't matter what their covering is. If they're evil, they'll take a church and do it in the church. If they're evil, they'll take their title in the school and do it in the school system. If they're evil, they'll take the title of the coach as a gymnast. And that, by the way, that happens a lot. I have heard of so many stories of girls and boys that were abused, sexually abused by their coach, their gymnast coach. And even on the football, baseball, whatever, the other day, I did a podcast with a man that he was raped by a guy on the football team after a football game one night. And he had gotten drunk and, they were all doing whatever. And the guy passed out and the other guy raped him while he was passed out. And he had horrible memories in his adulthood coming back. These bad things happen, and the devil doesn't care where you are, right? He doesn't care. He's preying on whoever, seeking whom he may devour. That's what the Bible says. So the Bible says too that we are to be smart. We are to be diligent, and we are to be aware that he's out there. And that's what I want to bring recognition to. I want to be smart. I want to be aware that there's an enemy out there, and there are ways that we can protect our children. And that's what Jimmi is doing too with the 911 rescue. Jimmi, I just want to thank you so much. We're going to have you back again next week, and I want you to talk about your process of healing and how it came about. I'm so curious to know. You have a book called Healed, and I can't wait to hear about that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. The healing process is equally fascinating.
Yes, it is. And thank you guys for listening and watching One Voice Makes a Difference. If this has ministered to you or if it has touched your heart in any way, I want you to share it with someone, and let's get the word out. Let's get the good news. Even though bad things happen to good people, there is a future. You can make a decision. I'm not going to let my past dictate my future. I can become something different. And Jimmy's going to tell us how he did that next week. All right. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Thank you for listening to One Voice Makes a Difference. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing and reviewing the show on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell your friends about One Voice too. Your voice helps the show reach more people and to spread the gospel. If you'd like to hear more about my personal story, you can purchase my book, One Voice, on my website, www.janetswanson.org, or on Amazon and audible.com. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. Most importantly, if you're in a crisis, please call 24/7 Crisis Hotline at 1-800-273-8255 or visit suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Don't wait, your life matters.